My daughter handed me a gift bag at her bridal shower and said, "Mom, I found something special for you to wear to the wedding." Everyone at the table was watching. I thought she was being sweet. I opened it and pulled out a dress the color of a traffic cone. Bright, blinding orange. Not coral. Not burnt sienna. Orange. The kind of orange you see on highway construction workers at 2 in the morning so they don't get run over. I looked up at her. She was smiling the way she always smiles when she knows she's done something and wants to see how you'll react. My future son-in-law, her fiancé Garrett, was sitting right next to her, and he looked genuinely confused for just a second before he caught himself and looked down at his plate. I said, "Oh honey, what is this?" She said, "It's your dress for the wedding, Mom. I had all the bridesmaids pick their own style in dusty rose. But I found this for you. Isn't it fun?" Fun. I held up that dress in front of a room full of her friends and her soon-to-be mother-in-law, and I understood exactly what was happening. I just didn't let my face say so. I folded it carefully, placed it back in the tissue paper and said, "Thank you, sweetheart." And I smiled. Because I am 53 years old, and I have learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not give someone the reaction they came for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got here first. My name is not important, but my story is. I am a retired school librarian from outside Columbus, Ohio. I live alone now, have for about 11 years, since my divorce from Theodore was finalized. I raised 2 kids mostly by myself, working full-time, taking on weekend shifts at a bookstore for 3 years when money was particularly tight. My son Owen is 30 now and lives in Portland. He calls every Sunday. He's steady like that. My daughter, Kristen, is 28. She has always been Theodore's daughter in the ways that matter. She has his charm. His ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room right up until the moment she doesn't need you anymore. And she has his way of looking at me like I'm an inconvenience that became a habit. Theodore remarried 5 years ago. A woman named Cheryl who is 41 and who, to her credit, has always been polite to me. Their relationship isn't my business. But Kristen's relationship with Cheryl became something I watched carefully for years. Kristen worshipped her, called her mom within 8 months. And she has every right to. I am not in the business of policing what a grown woman calls her stepmother. But it hurt, in the way these things hurt. Quietly and without anyone acknowledging it. The engagement to Garrett happened fast. They'd been together 2 years. Got engaged on a trip to Asheville and suddenly my kitchen table was covered in wedding magazines every time Kristen stopped by. I was happy for her. I genuinely was. Garrett is a kind, steady man who works in logistics and coaches his nephew's little league team on weekends. He calls me Mrs. H and always asks if I need anything carried to my car. I liked him from the start. The wedding planning started about 14 months before the date. I was involved in the beginning. Kristen and I went to 2 venue tours together. I contributed $5,000, which, for a retired librarian living on a pension and part-time consulting, was not nothing. I wrote that check and I handed it to her without conditions, because she is my daughter, and I love her and that's what you do. But somewhere around month 4 of planning, I started getting left out, not dramatically, not with a conversation or an explanation, just. The invitation stopped coming, the venue decision was made. The caterer was chosen. The florist was hired. I found out about each of these things after the fact, usually through a group text that I was included in alongside 8 other people. I told myself it was her wedding. I told myself not to be that mother. I kept my mouth shut. The bridesmaids were 6 of her closest friends from college and her best friend from high school. I was not a bridesmaid. That was fine. I'm her mother, not her peer. But I was told I would have a special role in the ceremony. Walking in before the processional, lighting a candle at the memorial table in honor of my mother, who had passed 4 years earlier. That felt meaningful. I held on to that. About 6 weeks before the wedding, the bridesmaids started posting on Instagram, all 6 of them in dusty rose, some in spaghetti strap, some in off-the-shoulder, some in meaty length. All different silhouettes, all the same warm muted pink. It looked beautiful, cohesive but individual. I commented a heart on 2 of the posts and thought, she really does have good taste. Then came the bridal shower. It was held at Cheryl's house. Not at mine, not at a restaurant, at Cheryl's house. Cheryl hosted it. Cheryl paid for the catering. Cheryl's friends mixed with Kristen's friends in Cheryl's living room while I sat on a rented chair and made conversation with women I'd never met. I'm telling you this not to be resentful. I processed that resentment a long time ago, but because context matters. By the time Kristen handed me that gift bag, I was already running on fumes. When I pulled out the orange dress, I heard one of her college friends make a small sound. Not quite a gasp, more like the involuntary noise a person makes when they're startled and immediately try to cover it. I didn't look up at her. I kept my eyes on Kristen. She said, "All the other mothers are wearing blush and champagne tones. I thought something bold would be fun for you, Mom. You always said you liked standing out." I said once 20 years ago at a school spirit week that I liked the boldness of primary colors. That is the foundation on which she built this. I looked at the dress again. It was not my size. I am a size 12. The tag said 16. It was floor length, polyester, and had a sash that tied in the front with a large bow that sat at the stomach. It looked like something you'd find at the bottom of a clearance rack, in a shop that was going out of business. I said, "Where did you find this, honey?" She said, "Online." "It was a good deal," I said. "How much was it?" She said, "Like $22. Her bridesmaids wore dresses that each cost somewhere between $150 and $200. Garrett's mother, a perfectly nice woman named Beverly who lives in Dayton, was wearing a custom-tailored champagne blazer and dress set that Kristen had helped her select at a boutique in Dublin. I know this because Kristen had mentioned it twice over the previous 3 months. For me, $22, size 16, traffic cone orange from the internet. I looked around the room. Some of the women were looking at their laps. A couple were looking at me. Cheryl was in the kitchen doorway and her face was doing something complicated. She looked almost embarrassed, which I gave her credit for. I said, "Thank you, Kristen." And I put it back in the bag. She said, "You're going to wear it, right?" "I think it'll look so unique," I said. "I'll try it on when I get home." She said, "Mom." And there was a warning in that one syllable. The same warning she'd been giving me since she was 16. The one that meant, "Don't embarrass me by having feelings in front of people." I said, "I heard you, sweetheart." And I changed the subject because I am 53, and I have been in harder rooms than that one. On the drive home that night I called Owen. I told him what happened. There was a long pause and then he said, "Do you want me to come for the wedding?" He lives in Portland. He was already planning to come. But I understood what he was really asking. He was asking if I needed backup. I told him I was fine. I told him not to say anything to Kristen. Schrei said, "Mom, you're not going to wear that dress, right?" And I sat in my driveway in the dark for a moment. And then I said, "I haven't decided yet. Here is what you need to understand about me. I spent 26 years as a school librarian. My job was to be invisible in the service of something larger, to organize, to support, to recommend, to stand quietly in the background so that kids could have the room they needed to discover things. I am not a dramatic person. I do not like scenes. I do not like confrontation. But I know what it means when someone hands you a costume instead of a dress. I spent 2 decades watching children communicate what they actually thought of each other through small cruelties that adults weren't supposed to notice. I noticed. And I recognized, sitting in that gift bag in my passenger seat, exactly what my daughter had done. She did not expect me to wear it. She expected me to call her the next morning, upset. She expected me to beg to be included in the blush and champagne palette like a reasonable parent. She expected me to make a fuss, so she could tell Garrett and Cheryl and her friends that her mother was being difficult again, that she'd tried to do something fun and her mother had turned it into a whole thing. I had been the difficult one for years. Every time I had a feeling, it became evidence of my difficulty. So I had learned to compress my feelings into very small, very manageable shapes, and I had gotten quite good at it. So I made a different decision. I tried the dress on. It was as bad as I thought. The 16 fit my hips but gaped at the chest and the sash sat in exactly the wrong place. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for a long time. Then I got out my sewing kit. I have been sewing since I was 19. My grandmother taught me. I'm not a seamstress by any professional measure, but I can take in a seam. I can adjust a hem. I can move a waistline. Over the next 4 evenings, after dinner, I worked on that dress. I took in the chest. I moved the sash up 3 inches. I removed the bow entirely, and replaced the sash with a thin belt from another dress I owned. Black, simple, nothing that would add color but would break the volume and give the waist some shape. I steamed it until the wrinkles released. I found simple gold earrings, flat gold sandals, and a small gold clutch that I'd had for years. By the time I was done, that dress was still orange. That was not something I could change, and I wasn't trying to. But it fit me, and I stood up straight in it, and I looked like a woman who had gotten dressed on purpose. I did not call Kristen. I did not send her a photo. I said nothing. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-September, held at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city. It was a genuinely beautiful venue, rolling hills, a barn that had been converted into an events space, string lights everywhere. The weather held. It was 71 degrees and clear. I arrived and I walked in and I found my seat. The bridesmaids were beautiful in their dusty rows. Garrett's family was gathered in champagne and navy. Beverly looked elegant, and I sat in the second row in my orange dress, with my gold earrings and my flat sandals, and I watched people notice me and look again. A woman I didn't know leaned over and said, "I love your dress. Is that color intentional? It's stunning against the vineyard." I said, "Very intentional, thank you." Garrett's aunt, a woman in her early 60s, stopped me on the way from my seat to the memorial table and said she'd been watching me since I walked in because she loved a woman who committed to a statement. I said, "I was asked to make one, so here I am." She laughed and touched my arm. Then I lit the candle at the memorial table for my mother, and I walked back to my seat and I sat down and I watched my daughter come down the aisle. She looked stunning. She really did. Her dress was a fitted crepe gown with a chapel train, and her hair was pinned up with small flowers woven through it. She looked like herself on her best day, which is what a bride should look like. And for a moment I forgot everything else and just watched her, and felt the thing that lives underneath all the other complicated things. The love that doesn't have anywhere else to go. But I also saw the moment she saw me. She was halfway down the aisle, on Theodore's arm, and her eyes found me in the second row. And something moved across her face. Surprise, recalibration, something. And then she looked forward again and kept walking. I don't know what she expected. I don't know if she expected me to not show up, or to show up in different clothes, or to be invisible in some way she'd imagined. But I was there, in orange, looking like I meant it, and she had to keep walking, and she did. And the ceremony was lovely. At the reception, I ate my salmon and drank 1 glass of wine, and danced once with Owen, who had flown in from Portland, and who kept squeezing my hand every time he looked at me in that dress and trying not to laugh. I talked to Beverly for almost an hour, and found out we had both lived briefly in the same neighborhood in Columbus in the late 1990s, and might have walked past each other at the same grocery store without knowing. I danced with Garrett's uncle, who was 71 and sharp as a tack. Kristen did not come over to me until after the first dance. She came over while I was at the drink table, getting a sparkling water, and she stood next to me and said quietly, "I didn't think you'd actually wear it," I said. "You picked it out," she said. "It's a little much, don't you think?" I said. "Several people have told me it's their favorite look of the night." One woman asked me where I bought it. Kristen said nothing. I said, "Congratulations, honey. You married a good man. I hope you're very happy." And I walked back to my table. I want to be precise here. I did not say it warmly and I did not say it coldly. I said it the way you say something you mean completely, that you have also for the moment exhausted. I meant every word. Garrett is a good man. I do hope she is happy. And I had run out of softness for the moment, so I said the true thing and walked away. About 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. But it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of repotting a plant, and I picked up. It was the photographer. Her name was Alice, and she was a freelance photographer who had shot the wedding. She told me she was calling because she was putting together the full gallery for Kristen and Garrett, and in the process of editing she had run into something she wasn't sure how to handle. She said, "I wanted to give you a heads up because it involves you, and I thought you should know before the gallery goes to the couple." She told me that several of her best shots of the ceremony, not candids, but official framing shots, the kind that end up in the album, prominently featured me, because I was in the second row, close to the aisle, in a dress that photographed brilliantly against the vineyard. The late afternoon light had hit the orange in a way that was, she said, genuinely striking. In multiple shots, I was visible just over the bride's shoulder, or in the background of wide-angle processional shots, or at the memorial table with the candle, where there was an entire sequence that she described as one of the most emotionally complete sets she'd shot in years. She said, "I want to be honest with you. I've been doing this for 12 years, and the memorial table photos are going to be in my portfolio, if that's okay with you." I sat down on my kitchen floor next to the repotted plant. I said, "That's fine." "Of course," she said. "I just thought you should know. A lot of brides ask me to edit around certain things in post, and I wasn't sure how your daughter would handle seeing how prominent you are. I can't unshoot what I shot, but I wanted you to be prepared if there was a conversation." I thanked her. I told her she'd done nothing wrong. I told her the dress was very much intentional. She laughed. She said, "I figured." Kristen called me 4 days after the gallery went live. I was not unkind. I listened. I let her say what she needed to say, which included several things about how I had made it about myself, and how she couldn't believe I had actually worn it, and how the photos were ruined, because every wide shot had this huge orange thing in the corner. I said, "Krist, you chose the dress. You handed it to me in front of your guests and asked me to wear it. I wore it." She said that wasn't the point. I said, "Then help me understand the point." She didn't have an answer for that. Or she had one, but she couldn't say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean admitting what she'd tried to do. And Kristen has many of her father's qualities, but she doesn't have his ability to lie directly to someone who is looking at her. There was a long silence, and then she said, "The memorial table pictures are actually really beautiful." I said, "Yes, Alice told me." Another silence. She said, "Mom, I don't know why it's always so hard between us, and that question is the one I've been carrying around for 28 years. Why it's hard. Why it's always been a little sideways between us. I have theories. I think some of it is that she looked at me for a long time and saw everything she was afraid of becoming. A woman alone. A woman working hard for not enough. A woman who didn't get the life she'd planned. I think she loved me and was furious at me at the same time for years, and that those two things got tangled up in ways neither of us knew how to untangle. I don't know if I'm right, but it's what I have." I said, "I don't know either, baby, but I'm still here," and I meant that one without any conditions attached. Things have not become simple since then. We are not suddenly fixed. She and Garrett came over for Thanksgiving, and it was cordial and sometimes warm, and once, briefly, she sat next to me on the couch while the game was on, and leaned her head back and said, "This couch is really comfortable," and I said, "I've had it since 2006. And she laughed, and it was a real laugh, and we just sat there for a minute like that. Owen says progress is progress. He's probably right. I still have the dress. It's hanging in my closet between my winter coat and the blue blazer I wear to my consulting gigs. I haven't worn it again, but I haven't gotten rid of it either." Alice sent me a print of the memorial table photo, me, standing over the candle, the vineyard going gold behind me, orange dress and gold earrings, and my mother's name on a small placard beneath the flame. She sent it without me asking. Just a note that said, "Thought you should have this one." It's on my bookshelf now, next to a picture of Owen and Kristen as kids, squinting into the sun somewhere at a lake I can't quite remember, and a small framed quote my mother cross-stitched when I was young that says, "She stood." And that was enough. I think about that a lot. I stood. In orange, at my daughter's wedding, in a dress that cost $22 that she thought would make me disappear. And somehow in every single photograph you cannot miss me.